Okay, so I'm going to sound like I am American, but as you know, Boris Johnson was born in New York and moved here. I was born here and went there, so I don't know if the swap helped, or you can let me know later. I was born and raised in a place called Peckham, delightful area of London, which some of you may well know. Trained at the University of Westminster and then at the UCL. I actually committed my first crime at the RIBA. I volunteered here as a student, and Tadao Ando did an exhibit here. And as he was putting up the exhibit, he would draw with his pencil on the walls to and at the end of it, he put his pencil down, and I still have it. So first off, I apologize to the RIBA for stealing, but if you'd like your pencil back, I can give it to you. Like I said, I was trained in the UK, and I was very fortunate enough to get a job working as an architectural designer in New York. During my time in New York, I co-founded Architecture for Humanity, and we worked to build a network of architects that are fairly global to work on humanitarian programs, both local and international. We had a chapter here in London, which is now known as the Open Architecture Collaborative, and they worked on a series of projects, including working at the crisis centers, doing kind of the Christmas time redesigns, as well as the remakery down in Brixton. So as the organization grew, we were probably most known for our post-conflict and post-disaster reconstruction, but we worked on a lot on poverty alleviation. The thing that came out of that experience of the 15 years of working on that is most communities had never met an architect before. They didn't understand an architect, and quite frankly, they never asked whether you were licensed or not. They just wanted to know, could you help build with them? And through that process, I learned that there were quite a few architects that had never been trained, but certainly were making enormous change around the world. So over the course of the last 20 years, the work's been fairly global. We ran offices in multiple countries, and after AFH, I ended up running the foundation for Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. We worked on a number of projects together before joining Airbnb. Concurrently, I also ran Small Works, which I will talk about next. So the three challenges I have, and I'm glad that Ben mentioned the idea of kind of the code of conduct or the code of ethics for architect. I actually think that the social value of our work is going to be the defining factor of why you hire a professional architect over somebody who can just build in your communities. Because kind of the idea of professional trust is vital for a number of these communities to realize their dreams. The other thing is, and this is a little controversial, is that I don't think you're an architect if you don't build. Like, if you build a building, you can call yourself an architect. But unbuilt work to me is just unbuilt work. And if you can't get your work built, be the bank, become the developer. And over the years, we've ended up becoming the developer of projects, funding them, supporting them, and actually finding a return for them. And the third is that we need to find a way, the process of being an architect, the way you work with the client, you work with the community, you work through all the issues of government regulation and process. You know, people say to me at Airbnb, Airbnb is challenged with all these government issues that you have to deal with and government regulations. I always say, have you ever been an architect? Because, being an architect, you have to really go up against some really strong issues that you have to kind of combat if you want to kind of fulfill the needs of the community. So I actually think that the architectural process can be used as a community building tool as opposed to just a tool for building. So I'm going to talk about the rise of the architectural entrepreneur because I think I'm the definition of which. I did my part one, I was in the middle of my part two, I ended up starting a nonprofit, and my career as an architectural builder took off, but my career as an architect ended, and under the way we see licensing. So you've got to think about how we're going to shape the future, and by 2044, there will be about 9 billion people on the planet. Our biggest challenge is how we're going to house the last billion people that are coming. Because obviously, the effects of climate change, resource scarcity, future conflict are going to affect the next last great push of mankind before we begin to shrink as a species. So understanding where they are. So you've got the mega cities. This is, sorry, I know you're recording. You want me to get close. Sorry. Maybe I should do this. Can I do this one? Sorry, I'm a walker, and I just had 3 Turkish coffees. So this is in Mumbai, where there is as many people living in informal settlements than formal settlements. And so how do we work with these cities as they begin to grow and blur the lines between informality and formality? You have shrinking cities. 2 out of 3 cities in the United States are actually shrinking, and shrinking populations are deeply affecting the societal standings of countries. In Japan, for instance, we're going to lose about 700 towns and villages in the next decade as a result of shrinking populations. Shared city, this is the University of Lancaster that's been working on a series of projects to look at how do we create shared systems within the cities as our resources become much more challenged, and how do the great cities of the north actually work together on shared governance. Instant cities, these are everything from informal camps, work camps, to refugee camps. There are huge numbers of them, and most people see them as short-term camps. But a quick show of hands, how many people have been camping? It's a very American thing, but wow, British people camp too. Okay, when you camp, does it look like this? So we actually use the term refugee camp because it makes it easier for us to understand that it's a temporal thing that's not so bad. When you're camping, it's a little bit hard to do. A week, it's a little tough. And you're like, oh, well, they're in a camp. But actually, it's a city. And this is a city I worked in, Zaatari, in Jordan for 3 years. And living and working there, you understand the dynamics is much the same as a city. This is the Champs-Élysées. This is the shopping street where you can get everything from cakes to wedding dresses to car parts. My favorite, and you can find this online, is some of the builders that I work with started a pimp your bike company. So you get your free bike from the UN, and then they would pimp it. So it would be like have all this. It's like being at Burning Man. And they have an amazing business, and they do about 20 to 30 bikes a day, turning them into these like wild kind of fun rides. And so, working in Zaatari, at the time there was about 80,000 people living there. You cannot leave the camp. You need police permission to even exit. And so it's a forced city where people don't have jobs, they don't have opportunity, and that can cause a whole bunch of societal issues. And this is what they call architecture, right? These are these kind of caravan boxes which have no air conditioning, and the bathrooms have no lighting, so the risk of violence for young girls is great. So, as we're looking at these massive growths, right now we have about 68 million people that are currently displaced. There's actually more people displaced on the planet than there are British people, or actually people from the United Kingdom. So you think about that as a country, it would be the 21st largest country in the world. And then on top of that, there's about 171 million people affected by a civil conflict. When we're looking at resource scarcity and where architects can play a role in this, 50% of the global poor are in these conflict-affected areas. But in the next 10 years, it's going to be more like 80%. So, we actually have a huge decline in global poverty, but the pockets where poverty remains are in these fragile states. Now, fast forward, we also have shrinking nations, and this kind of future shock that's going to happen to the world is that climate change isn't about rising sea levels, it's about aggravated storms and the lack of resources. There's certainly going to be in areas where there's high drought, and so you'll see areas like Bangladesh and Central Africa really suffer from long-term drought, whereas the Ring of Fire, which is around the Pacific Ocean, are going to have terrible typhoons and hurricanes and earthquakes. So it's the repetitive nature of these disasters. And so how do we as architects actually respond to future threats? And by that date that I talked, the 9 billion people on the planet, there will be about 325 million people displaced. right? So that would be about the size of the United States of America right now. So about the 4th largest country in the world will be displaced. So how do we as a profession actually use our expertise to respond to that? So the last 20 years, I've really been looking at how do we design for communities and with communities. And this is one of my favorite photographs because in this photograph, there's a licensed engineer, there's a licensed architect, there's community leaders, but you don't know who is who, right? And that's how it should be. Using kind of an inclusive design and designing a process that's based on the community's way of interaction, not on the formal way that architects do a PowerPoint presentation and put up printed 24 by 36 boards and say, well, this is what we're going to do. Actually understanding different ways of communication. And ensuring that the work is professional. There's nothing worse than volunteerism, right? We're not going on vacation to help people. Like, you know, it's not a vacation for them. And what they're looking for is for professional practice within very stressed needs. And then that commitment to build. So this is, after Katrina, we ended up building about 93% of East Biloxi, Mississippi, primarily because we had licensed architects. The city, the state, the government suddenly said, well, you're bringing licensed professionals together. You guys can just take over the city. And we were able to give them the right to actually rebuild that city. And part of that is also how do we create employment. So actually some of the construction methodologies we used were not the most advanced, but they actually created new jobs and created new employment avenues for those most displaced. So I'm going to just move very quickly because you want to see projects. Projects we worked on were from sublime to ridiculous. So this was up in the Swat Valley of Pakistan after deep flooding. We worked with this amazing architect called Yasmin Lari, the first female licensed architect of Pakistan, 9th licensed architect in the country. She retired and she moved up into the mountains and she started teaching people how to do bamboo construction post-earthquake. And we had got funding from Google to build tents and tent camps. And without their knowledge, we actually ended up building 40,000 homes. And so, you know, the other thing about being entrepreneurial is sometimes you have to break the rules of your own funders. So when Google asked us to see the tent camps, we put them on Google Maps and we said, oh, look, there's villages, right? So the idea is, like we said, you know, we went far and beyond. This is a project done by 2 19 and 20-year-old design students on the Kenyan border. There were doctors that were trying to treat people in rural villages and had a hard time getting access to electricity and other resources to run the clinics. And these guys came up with a really interesting idea, which is you're in a village, you have a tent clinic. At the end of your 1 week working in there, you put the whole clinic on the back of a camel, which has solar panels on it. You hit the camel on the arse. It walks to the next village. And by the time you've got to the next village, it's generated enough energy to run the clinic in the next village. So it's a camel-powered clinic. And so again, right, none of these students are licensed, none of these students have gone through the process, but they're practicing architecture. They're creating a methodology to allow these doctors to run these clinics. There's now 5 of these running in northern Kenya. To these kind of instant cities, this was kind of like using 3D printing after the tsunami in Japan to kind of create these kind of instant homes and facilities. This is in Haiti, where we used mapping of materials within a 5-kilometer radius to understand how we could build schools without bringing in material. And so we were building these schools for about 40,000 pounds. And all of the materials came from within the local community. We ended up building about a dozen of these. In Zimbabwe, where our design fellows were looking at the issue of using sports as a system for social change. And one of the builders in the local community was worried about violence in football, right? People, they play games, the game doesn't end well. And he said, within the aggregate, is it possible that we could actually add this flower, which is lavender? And so they actually used lavender in the aggregate of the stabilized soil block. And so this entire football training facility smells of lavender, which is a really hard way to pick a fight with someone when there's a floral bouquet happening while you're in the changing rooms. And certainly enough, it kind of like changed the dynamic of how people interact in this building. So, the sense, your nose is also something that needs to have an architectural response. In Shanghai, there were migrant communities where kids were going from city to city as their parents were building buildings and they weren't getting access to schools, so we were able to build shipping containers that they could actually get their education. And when their parents moved to another city, the school moved with them, so there was a continuity of education in Dhaka using bamboo. In Afghanistan, I spent a few years working in Kabul. We built the skate park, which also doubles as an after-school education facility and a safe space for kids. Interestingly enough, when we opened this, the president of the country, Ashraf Ghani, asked if our team of architects could help them on the demilitarization of Kabul. And I said, why? And he said, for one, you're not military professionals, and two, you're architects. So that's a really interesting thing, that the president of a country recognizes that the profession has the capabilities and adds the skill set to think about demilitarization of a city. And these don't have to be inexpensive. This is about £2,000 to take down streets and turn them into sports facilities. But when there aren't architects, people are just as innovative and they figure out their own way to create building solutions. So, in northern Iraq, where it gets really cold, they took the old UN tents and actually created their own homes around it. So if you guys don't show up, architecture's still gonna happen. So I'm gonna talk about one quick project. You guys can give me time. You're gonna have to kick me off at some point because I have a bunch of projects. So this is a project I did outside of Airbnb, which is looking at a redeployable building system to build schools and houses for Syrian refugees on the Syrian border in Jordan. So Syria's happened for about 7 years. There's about 6.5 million people that are displaced. This again is Zatari, but at a street level. So from I'm sorry, that's my president. He apparently is worried about balloons, so he's flying over London to go golfing. So please apologize for that. So this is on the ground in Zatari, and so the view is very different. It's very much one of abandonment. And what you don't know is certainly in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, the temperature shift is massive. So this is summertime, it's boiling hot. Kids have got nowhere to go, but in the wintertime, it's freezing. So the idea of tent camps just simply don't work. And so we said, what if we could have a redeployable building mechanism that can be built with scaffolding systems, because we could smuggle it into Zatari refugee camp without the UN's knowledge. Here's the good thing about the UN. It takes them 2 weeks to realize something's gone wrong. So as long as you can build in under 2 weeks, you can get something up and going. So that was our mandate, is could you build a school in less than 14 days? That was built by locals, that could incorporate solar and agricultural roofs to grow vegetables. And then could they expand into quarters and eventually kind of communities? So we came up with this kind of school idea. We worked with local communities. We actually identified both the teachers and the builders. The builders of the school were the parents of the kids, because no one's going to actually not build a good building when their kids are getting built in it. So using that as a methodology to ensure good construction. And then we smuggled the equipment into the camp on the back of trucks, just saying that they were just materials we needed for construction. And then we had very few days to get this done. So let me see if I can get through this quick. So this is day 6, day 7, day 8. There was tea about every 4 hours, so I will. This is day 10, day 11, 12. We got busted on day 13, and so we quickly had to finish on day 14 and get the school operational and running. And so, how long have I got, peoples? 5 minutes? Okay. So as a result of this, we ended up being able to put together a whole team of architects and builders that were from within the camp. So when we went through the camp, we began to speak to people. We don't say, are you a refugee? It's like, what were your skill set? What did you know what did you do when you were in Aleppo or in Homs? There are architects in there. There are builders. There are designers. And all we had to do is to figure out the skill set to put together a team. And so all of our team were refugees, and you identified them as people in need, but we were able to identify a team that were a construction team made up of architects, engineers, and builders who were able to actually use their skill set to kind of create these buildings. It won a bunch of prizes. But more importantly, the community loved it so much, we're actually able to build another 12 schools within the camp. And the first girls from the camp went to university after passing their exams last year. Okay, I have no time for this. I'm going to quickly do 5 minutes on Airbnb because you guys are probably interested. So Airbnb is called Airbnb because it means AirBed and Breakfast. Our founders couldn't afford their rent, and so they inflated 3 air mattresses, and they offered ham and cheese croissant for $25 a night, and built this website. 10 years later, our website looks like this. The growth of the company has been fairly rapid. Neil and I were just talking about how Airbnb and WeWork are kind of frenemies. We both have had this monumental growth of utilizing space. There's currently about 5 million properties. 300 million people have booked on Airbnb. We're in 88,000 cities and 191 countries. And interestingly enough, we're overwhelmingly female hosts. And last year, they earned about $10 billion. The most interesting thing I think about Airbnb is our mission. And our mission isn't to utilize people's homes to make money. It's actually to build a world where anyone can belong anywhere. So I was approached by the founders of Airbnb to come on board and look at how do we build an innovation team and work with an innovation team that's about social value and actually creating a world where anyone can belong anywhere. And so this team, our focus is creating the tools for exponential generosity, but more importantly is using our community in ways that extend belonging, design in an inclusive way, build at scale, and create acceptance, especially in a time when acceptance is not really is happening. And most important project that we're leading is open homes. And the idea of open homes is, in a time of great need, whether it be a natural disaster or conflict, would people be willing to open up their homes for people in need? In 2012, we had a host that said, could she donate her home after there'd been a hurricane on the East Coast? And we were able to very simply kind of recode our website to allow her to do this. Fast forward, we've now worked in about 250 disasters. We've opened up about 7,000 homes. After the Grenfell disaster, we actually worked with a number of agencies to house families and relatives of families that were looking for short-term shelter as opposed due to being displaced. And so it's a very simple system where we find people in need. We work with agency partners. We have a number of agency partners here in the UK, both for natural disasters and for refugees. And we have open homes hosts that are willing to open up their homes for those in need. And the reason for doing this is based on those numbers I showed before, is that we're not looking to solve today's problems, but we're looking to support solutions for tomorrow's problems through today's technology. Not only for those displaced, but the entire history of, or the length of people's displacement, which on average is about 17 years. So very briefly, again, as REBA's president mentioned, we need to be a much more vocal advocates of things that we believe in order to kind of own that leadership. And our founders are just as strong vocally. And there was a tweet by one of my founders that said, Airbnb is providing free housing to refugees and anyone not allowed into the United States. Stay tuned for more. Why is that tweet important? We didn't have a plan. We didn't have knowledge that he was going to do this. We didn't have a team. We found out when you found out. And it got retweeted 200,000 times, and we got a message saying, hey, by the way, you guys are the ones who are going to house everybody. And as a result of the travel ban, we were able to house about 30% of those affected. Now, what's interesting about this is we are a private company that's growing rapidly, that has valuation, and our founders publicly went out there against the President of the United States and his policies and said, we actually think you're wrong. We actually think these are stupid policies, and we actually think that it's wrong for mankind. And as a result, it's a huge risk for us to say we're going to take a political opinion. but it's very important because our belief systems and the core values of both our staff and of our community is one that believes in belonging. Actually, can we show? So during the Super Bowl last year, we showed this ad. We spent a lot of money to do 30 seconds to show this in the second quarter of America's biggest sporting event, which I still don't understand why it's called football, because you throw it. But this ended up being the most watched ad during the Super Bowl, and as a result of it, 12,000 people signed up to house those in need. What was amazing is most of those people were from Europe. So why you guys were watching the Super Bowl is beyond me, because it was probably at like 2 in the morning. But everyone in the UK and Europe said, well, we're willing to open up our Airbnb listing for those in need. And we said, okay, let's work with them. So we said, we're going to work for about 5 years. We're going to house 100,000 people. And we're going to build a website exclusively. If you don't want to list your property on Airbnb, you don't want to rent your property on Airbnb, that's okay. But if you want to open up your home for those in need, we can do that for you. And you don't have to be a part of the system. And so working with aid agencies and NGOs and refugees and those displaced, we were able to match people up. What was remarkable about this, and I know we have, depending on results last night, we were supposed to hate the French, but things have changed. But we had a problem with the French, which I'm sure as an English person you've heard many times. But the problem was we said we wanted to open up homes for short-term basis. Our French Airbnb hosts were like, no. I want to open up my home for all year. So as a result, in Paris, our Airbnb hosts have opened up their homes for over a year to refugees and helping them integrate into society. And we have dozens and dozens of French Airbnb hosts who say, I do not host anymore. I want to host refugees. And so what it showed to us is our community actually cared deeply enough about these social issues. They were actually willing to lose personal money that they were earning in order to do the right thing. And so we've housed around about 11,000 people to date. We're now operating in 40 countries. We have a team here in London, in Paris, in San Francisco, and we're about to expand into Latin America, Asia, and Africa. I think I'm done, because there's lots of other projects. So I'm going to end very quickly. Oh, this one's a beautiful project. So I'm very fortunate. This is just one of about 17 different projects we're working on globally. So Airbnb is an interesting company because we're not out there using our projects in order to gain, favor with our community, or we're doing it because the core values of the company mean that these are projects we truly believe in, and we'll do them regardless of what our community feels or not, but we feel that these are the main core values of the company. So we were looking at a whole variety of projects, everything from rural revitalization to working with indigenous communities to working on community development to working with refugees. But what's the guiding principle is our founders are designers. They went to design school. And so they believe in design thinking, and actually the architectural process is a way to understand how to work with communities. So if you have ideas, you can certainly email me. I'm just Cameron@airbnb.com. But I think what's important is being an architect doesn't mean that you're working for the architecture profession. It means you're affecting architecture. And that there is a huge number of careers. We were just noting that Bjarke Ingels now works for WeWork. There's a huge number of careers out there that are outside what we would call the social norms of our industry that actually desperately need architects to make change. So, I'm just one of many, many people that are not officially an architect, but practicing the process of architecture, and we need more of you. So, if you don't want to go down the kind of the route of professional practice, please join me in unprofessional practice and help the profession expand its reach and actually gain more respect globally. Thanks.
Actually, Cameron, I might ask you to stay up here. I'm going to slightly shift the programme around because I think leaving us with such kind of provocative thoughts will almost certainly invite some questions from the floor. So I might do the quick Q&A for Cameron now, and then I'll introduce Neil. So if you've got about 5 minutes of Q&A, sorry to put you on the spot, Neil.
That's all right.
I was just going to kick off with one question, actually. Obviously, you're talking about potentially a different way of practicing architecture. There's probably many people in this room who may well choose to remain in traditional practice, but it'd be great if they could find ways of applying the thinking that you've described in a kind of more kind of traditional, conventional practice setting. Could you maybe talk about or give some examples of how the people in this room might kind of advocate for a kind of an approach which brings more social value to what their practices do? Is it about breaking the rules?
So I'm in my early 40s, so I'm apparently a young professional, and it doesn't mean I'm not going to become a licensed architect. I love architecture, and I love the practice of architecture. What I hoped with Architecture for Humanity was not to kind of build an alternate to the practice, but actually to show a way that you could incorporate social programs within your own firms. And to be honest, when I worked as a designer, we used to call it the no asshole rule, which is like if we had a client, if we were doing a social project and a client got upset with us, we would drop that client, right? In the legal profession, in the medical profession, pro bono practice is part of not just the core of your profession, but it's in the code of ethics. And a doctor and a lawyer can say, at least in the States, can say, the reason I'm charging you $400 an hour is I have 10% of my work is for pro bono clients and we're helping the community in need. And I'm not going to stop doing that because that's part of my professional practice. And so I actually think the value of working with communities is not just to respond to your social core. And when you ask architecture students why they become architects, shaping and changing community is always in the top 3. When they get licensed, it's not in the top 3. But when they start, they always say, I want to make a change in my community. But we somehow knock that out of them. So if we can figure out how to embed social value and projects and pro bono projects within the industry, you would never have needed Architecture for Humanity, and you never would have needed Article 25 or any of the NGOs that do pro bono work. They're just simply filling a crack that's currently in our profession. So I actually would say, I would love it. Every practice said 10% of our work will be pro bono or at-cost work for communities in need. And that would revolutionize the industry because people suddenly see that our value is not just about making money for developers, but creating social change within the fabric of society. Sorry, rant. Okay.
Do you have any questions from the floor?
We're also hiring, so that would end another question. There's always lots of jobs at Airbnb. We're hiring about 40 people a week. So yes, I'm sorry, been stealing architects, but we're hiring architects too. So look at airbnb.com if you want a job. Any other quick questions? I'll take 2 more because I really came to see the other people speak too, because I haven't got my part 2 yet. I'm sorry for bringing up California weather.
Stunned everyone into silence. So if anyone comes up with any questions, maybe during the next session, we could still take some questions for Cameron.
Yeah, and if you want to see some of the built work we've done as well, let me know. We've done a whole bunch of building projects. If you look at yoshinocedarhouse.com, that was an amazing project where we worked with architects and community members to respond to shrinking communities in Japan. And we worked with a great architect called Go Hasegawa to create this beautiful cedar house. And so we're actually stepping our toes into architecture and what it means to create architecture, but only in the guise of community engagement and commitment. So Airbnb is never going to be an architectural firm, but we're certainly going to use the practice of architecture to shape communities. So that's a kind of coming soon hint. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Cameron. So our next speaker, Neil Boyd, is also operating with a global outlook. As Chief Financial Officer at Grimshaw, Neil oversees the financial operation in 5 countries over 4 continents. Formerly a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Neil sees his role as providing the financial stability which enables Grimshaw architects to design their fantastic projects. But he also understands the importance of the architects themselves understanding the impact of their project on business finances. So Neil's going to share his experience of why architects really need to understand the bottom line and also how they could avoid potentially disastrous cash flow issues. Thank you, Neil.
It's my clicker, isn't it? I can next. Okay, I'm going to start with the, sorry, I'm going to use this one.